Whenever a new video game system comes out, people are of course looking for a way to get the latest and greatest in technology without having to spend the full retail price. The Nintendo Switch 2 isn't exactly a very cheap system, coming in at $450 for the standard base model and $500 for the system packaged with Mario Kart World via a digital download, which of course is an $80 game in and of itself. Now, if you're not wanting to spend the full retail price on a system, of course, there are things you can do. One of the things is if you have a local GameStop or something like that, you could bring in some old systems that maybe you're no longer using, some old games, and put them towards the purchase price of whatever new system you want to get your greasy little hands on. And then, of course, there is the used marketplace for video game consoles. Now, more often than not, when a new system comes out, you don't see too many used systems pop up on the marketplace, but there are times where people will need to sell a system. Maybe they bought a Nintendo Switch 2 and realized, I don't really like this, and they want to get rid of it. Maybe they bought a Nintendo Switch 2 and had a financial situation come up, a bill to pay or something like that, so now they need to sell the system to recoup some of the money to pay the bill. But usually when you're talking about buying a used system, there isn't too much stuff to kind of worry about aside from the normal things such as, well, is it broken? You know, did they drop the system? Is the screen cracked? But the Nintendo Switch 2 is a bit of an interesting situation because people are realizing that some of these units that are available on the marketplace when it comes to used systems will not function at all. Now, this is a problem that actually did impact the original Nintendo Switch, but the difference was the original Nintendo Switch is a system that, of course, had hundreds of millions of systems available on the marketplace. So your chance of coming across one of these non-functioning systems was a lot smaller than something like the Switch 2. The Switch 2 is still pretty new, and if somebody is selling a used system for the Switch 2, there could be a problem with it. And it could be a catastrophic problem. Hopefully this doesn't become a huge widespread issue, and I don't necessarily think it will, but I want to talk about this today to kind of give you guys a little bit of a heads up, a little bit of a PSA, and kind of some things to look for when you are potentially buying a used Nintendo Switch 2 system. So if this is your first time on the channel, be sure to hit that subscribe button. So what is happening essentially involves a device that we have talked about before on this channel, the MIG Switch. Now, the MIG Switch was, of course, developed for the original Nintendo Switch. And in case you are unfamiliar with what it is, essentially this was a way for you to play, quote unquote, your backup copies of the games that you own on one cartridge. It would allow you to dump the games via the dumper that was supposed to come with the MIG Switch, basically dumping your cartridges, then you put them on your computer, and then you put them on the MIG Switch, and then you're good to go. You stick the MIG Switch cartridge into your Nintendo Switch system, stick it in and out to change between the games that are available on your MIG Switch, and now you have backup copies of all of these games that you have dumped yourself. Now, I put an emphasis on the dumper because I purchased a MIG Switch. I was supposed to get the dumper included with my MIG Switch system or a cartridge, and I did not. They ended up changing things, and I was not going to receive the dumper, so the MIG Switch to me was essentially a pointless thing. But I do know people that do have one. Now, obviously, when it comes to something like a MIG Switch, Nintendo themselves are not going to be very happy with it because of the piracy implications that can be had with it. We've actually talked about some issues with the MIG Switch and the Nintendo Switch 2 semi-recently on the channel, where essentially people were plugging in their MIG Switch into their Nintendo Switch 2 system and for some reason wanting to go online and play online games. For whatever reason, the system would then get triggered by something happening at Nintendo, which I'll kind of theorize on in just a second, and then the system would then be able to would not be able to access online functionality because of Nintendo blocking it, putting a block on the system itself. So what I think was happening with this is the whole thing about the MIG Switch to me was going to be reliant on the community and essentially somebody dumping the ROM in a format that the MIG Switch is capable of reading, because it does have a specific format that a game has to be in order to work on the MIG Switch, and then copies of that ROM then being shared online in various forums and other websites for other MIG Switch users to use. The problem with that is, if you're using all the same copy of a game, the game itself is going to have a traceable element to it based on that individual cartridge. So if you're signing in online and multiple people are using essentially what a system is reading as the same cartridge in different corners of the world, that's obviously going to raise some red flags. Now, I'm not 100% sure on that, but I do think that that is the situation that indeed happened. So people that were going online with their MIG Switch were then realizing, hey, now I can't go online with my Nintendo Switch 2 anymore, and that kind of sucks. So you would think that that would be the problem that we're highlighting here. And that is a problem and something to be a bit concerned about when buying a Nintendo Switch 2 on the used marketplace. But that's not the only thing that's happening, because it's now being discovered that if you are to take that system that has been blocked from going online and attempting to do a factory reset without being able to log in online, that will permanently brick the system to not work at all, meaning that no games will work, no single player games will work. The system itself is essentially just dead weight at this point in time. So people with a dead weight system are now getting a bit creative, for better or worse terminology there. They're being returned to Walmart as a defective system, and people are now getting refunds. Of course, you're going to have people that are going to be putting these systems up for sale potentially online as well. Places like Facebook Marketplace, eBay, Mercari. You're going to start seeing these Nintendo Switch 2 used systems pop up there, and it's not going to be a situation where you can necessarily test this out yourself. You're kind of rolling the dice and hoping that this system that just happens to be on the marketplace is not one that has been impacted by this. And that is a very problematic thing, because as of right now, there is no way to sort of fix that. It is just essentially a bricked system that could potentially cause problems down the road if this system stays in circulation. And because of the fact that the Nintendo Switch 2 is such a new system on the marketplace right now, there are not that many used systems in circulation to the point of where, you know, you've sold 100 million plus systems, so you kind of have that peace of mind. So how can you avoid potentially buying a bricked Nintendo Switch 2 system? First and foremost, you could kind of avoid the used marketplace itself. If something sounds too good to be true, a lot of times it is. If you're meeting up with someone on Facebook Marketplace in a shady parking lot or something like that, there's kind of a good chance that there could be a problem with the system. Now, places like Mercari and eBay do have some buyer protection when it comes to buying things online, so it is a little bit safer to do something like that, but you still do run the risk of getting a bricked system. Really, the only thing I can fully co-sign on doing would be buying a used Nintendo Switch 2 from like a GameStop or something like that. And a GameStop isn't going to really have many systems in stock, but at least that way you get the system in your hands and you can try out to see if the system boots up and allows you to do basic things. But there is that underlying element of, well, what if it's an online block that the system has because the previous owner had a MIG switch? You would not know that sort of thing until you went home and tried to set up the system itself, assuming that it had a factory reset done beforehand. But if it did have a factory reset done beforehand, then that system would be bricked completely. So there's a lot of questions as far as if there's any sort of way to avoid, you know, getting a lemon Nintendo Switch 2. And as it stands right now, you know, the risk is definitely very high. As time goes on and more units get out there and less of these units are from die-hard people or shady people who are trying to use things like a MIG Switch system and then running into problems with it because they're using the MIG switch in an incorrect manner as far as how it was intended to be done, then you'll at least have the peace of mind of there being so many systems on the marketplace that it probably won't happen to you. But in the intermediate future, like, I would kind of hold off a little bit. You know, I would be very hesitant, be very skeptical. Never feel like you're asking too many questions or wanting to see too much out of the system that you are spending potentially hundreds of dollars on, because you are the buyer. It is the seller that is supposed to convince you whether or not this is worth your money. The onus falls on the seller, not you. And so that's what I got for you guys today. It's definitely a bit of a convoluted situation, but, you know, even if just like a handful of people get impacted by this, like, I go back to the main point of, well, how many used systems are really on the marketplace right now for the Switch 2? And that number is definitely on the lower end of the spectrum when it comes to things like that. So you got to be careful, man. You just got to be careful, because you don't want to end up with a $400 brick that you can't do anything with. Unless it's a $400 brick of something else, but that's a topic for another day. Let me know in the comments section down below, though. What sort of tips do you have for your fellow viewers when purchasing a used Nintendo Switch 2 system? Things to look out for, things to maybe be a bit hesitant on. And as always, guys, thank you for checking out this video. If you are new to the channel, make sure you hit that subscribe button. Be sure to like, comment, and share. Hit the bell as well. And as always, I'll catch you guys on the next video. Later.